turismo. Emanuel, Maria Pontes, Muzar, professor Sérgio Marques, Andréa Dantas, Leliane Mendes, E neste momento, passamos a palavra para a professora Fernanda Rafim, para dar as boas-vindas neste primeiro dia.
Boa tarde a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos. Gostaria de cumprimentar aqui a mesa de abertura, na pessoa da professora Pamela, vice-diretora do CCSA, vice-coordenador do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Turismo e a chefe do Departamento de Turismo. Estava me lembrando, Pamela, do último evento que o programa organizou, né, onde foram apresentados resultados muito importantes de um projeto desenvolvido com apoio, né, do Ministério do Turismo, com a presença, inclusive, né, de representantes desse ministério. E como é importante a gente ver que um programa ainda jovem, né, já podemos considerar consolidado, né, mas que nasceu assim com um grupo tão pequeno, mas aguerrido, unido, já tem muitos frutos, né, a apresentar, inclusive com um impacto tão importante para a área, né, do turismo. E agora eu gostaria de ressaltar o que está me chamando a atenção é que o programa continua, né, com passos largos, né, acredito, para alcançar cada vez mais longe pessoas, lugares. Aqui nesse evento, não só a discussão da pesquisa e da atuação na área é importante fazer isso todos os dias, né? Então, acho que os docentes estão de parabéns, porque sempre vêm trazendo novos temas e sempre promovem e organizam eventos para que esses temas sejam discutidos, mas a internacionalização e um outro aspecto também, a articulação com a graduação. A gente não pode esquecer de trazer os futuros, né, turismólogos e de áreas afins, já desde antes de concluírem seu curso de graduação, a conhecer o que é que de mais importante, de mais atual se faz na área, se pesquisa na área, o que é que a gente tem descoberto a respeito nesses projetos. Então, acredito que a atividade do turismo ela é importante para o desenvolvimento humano, é importante do ponto de vista econômico, social. Se a gente pensar regionalmente, se a gente pensar internacionalmente, também. Então, acho que conhecer, estar envolvido com isso, é muito importante para quem vai atuar nessa área e está sempre atualizado e capacitado para isso. Então, acredito que esse evento traz essa dimensão e, com certeza, os resultados dessas discussões serão muito importantes para a sequência, né, das atividades, não só dos alunos de mestrado e doutorado deste programa, mas de todos que estão participando presencialmente ou remotamente, para os alunos de graduação também nas suas pesquisas, nas suas atividades, será também, com certeza, de grande valia. Eu gostaria de parabenizar o grupo que incansavelmente, né, vem se dedicando à organização de eventos tão importantes, tão interessantes e que tem atraído cada vez mais público. Dizer que continuem nesse caminho, que terão sempre todo o apoio da UFRN. Saudar a todos que estão aqui nesse auditório, no outro e nas suas casas, em qualquer lugar aí nas nuvens, né, que acompanham, que vão acompanhar as discussões, que tenham um bom aproveitamento, um bom evento. E quem não está, quem sabe nos próximos, consiga participar presencialmente, né, porque eu acho que a troca que acontece, né, nesses encontros, a troca de experiências, a troca de saberes, ela é muito importante para o crescimento de todos, né? Tanto nosso como também dos que nos visitam e colaboram com a gente. Então, parabéns a todos, bom evento e muito obrigada.
E neste momento, nós convidamos o professor Dr. Guilherme Bride para fazer uso da palavra.
Boa tarde. Eu gostaria de informar que o nosso ilustre coordenador do PPG-TUR e coordenador do evento, do EITUR, o professor Ricardo Lanzarini, ele está em casa por recomendação médica. Está tudo bem, ele está nos acompanhando online, está me mandando mensagem aqui. Mas então cabe a mim dizer algumas palavras em nome do PPG-TUR sobre esse importante evento. Então, eu gostaria, obviamente, de saudar a nossa pró-reitora adjunta, professora Fernanda Nervo Rafim, a pró-reitoria de pós-graduação, uma grande parceira do PPG-TUR, temos desenvolvido aí muitas ações em conjunta. Então, parte desse sucesso todo que nós estamos vivenciando, experienciando, também se deve a essa parceria, esse apoio que nós temos da pró-reitoria de pós-graduação da UFRN. Então, muito obrigado. Destaco também a vice-diretora do CCA, a professora Pamela Medeiros Brandão, nossa turismóloga da casa, né, também aí já muito inteirada desses processos todos que vêm acontecendo tanto no DETUR quanto no PPG-TUR, e também aí nos apoiando enquanto chefia do nosso centro, um centro muito celebrado, muito comemorado. E também a nossa chefe de departamento, a professora Regina, né, Regina Ferreira de Araújo, que está aí já é uma veterana de casa, ao mesmo tempo com pouco tempo de casa. Então, pela intensidade das experiências e também pela parceria do DETUR, é importante que a gente possa continuar com essa ponte graduação e pós-graduação, tão bem falado pela professora Fernanda, e o quanto isso impacta positivamente nas produções, nas ações em conjunto e na qualidade dos programas, tanto de graduação e graduação vinculados ao turismo. Então, essas parcerias com o DETUR, né, são aí muito duradouras e estão apenas começando. Queria fazer uma saudação especial ao nosso conferencista de hoje. Vamos ver se eu consigo falar corretamente, né, o professor Dr. Emmanuel Eduampong, da Wageningen University, da Holanda. Fazer uma saudação especial, né, pela sua participação e já dar as boas-vindas ao nosso programa. Espero que tenhamos aí muitas parcerias ao longo desses anos. E faço uma saudação igualmente, né, aos docentes, discentes, pesquisadores, demais participantes do Encontro Internacional de Turismo da UFRN EITUR 2023. Faço uma saudação especial também àqueles que nos acompanham virtualmente pelo canal do YouTube do CCSA. Conforme falado, né, esse é um evento híbrido, então nós vamos ter aí todas essas modalidades de ações que vão poder estar sendo ofertadas a todos. Queria dizer que nós estamos vivendo um 2023 muito comemorativo. Para dizer algumas das datas importantes. 65 anos da UFRN, 50 anos do nosso CCSA e 15 anos do PPG-TUR. Destaco também que a nossa querida UFRN, Universidade Pública, ela aparece classificada, né, em muitos mecanismos oficiais e profissionais de classificação de universidades, ela está sempre ranqueada entre as melhores universidades da América Latina, o que é um indício evidente da qualidade das nossas ações de ensino, pesquisa e extensão, e também dos nossos docentes, discentes egressos. Então, a gente tem aí, sim, né, muito o que comemorar nesse ano de 2023. E cabe, obviamente, né, reforçar aquilo que a prof. Fernanda falou muito bem, a gente destacar o reconhecimento obtido pelo PPG-TUR UFRN, que hoje ostenta o conceito 5 na avaliação quadrienal da CAPES. Então, sempre é importante a gente, né, tá trazendo essas nossas conquistas, que, como eu disse, são um esforço do trabalho conjunto que a gente vem desenvolvendo nessa universidade. Bom, e diante de todos esses indicadores de qualidade, eu destaco também a relevância e protagonismo do PPG-Tour em promover, em organizar, em sediar mais um evento internacional, tal como a proposta do EITUR 2023. Conforme já foi dito, nós tivemos aí um número muito expressivo de artigos submetidos, de resumos expandidos submetidos. Então, isso naturalmente reforça a qualidade dessas ações, desses eventos que a gente consegue proporcionar aqui para o FRN. E o evento, que esse ano tem o tema central, os novos olhares sobre a pesquisa e prática em turismo, ele tem justamente essa função de discutir turismo sob uma perspectiva de diferentes escalas, regional, nacional e internacional, e mais do que isso, promover o intercâmbio de experiências entre profissionais da área, que a gente sabe que é tão importante. A nossa programação é muito vasta, conforme o que vocês já podem experienciar. Teremos aí conferências, palestras, minicursos, lives, rolezinho gastronômico, apresentação de trabalhos, tanto a nível de graduação e pós-graduação. Então, temos aí realmente uma vasta programação para todos vocês. E, por isso, obviamente, eu gostaria de, em nome da coordenação, desejar que vocês tenham um ótimo evento, que nós tenhamos aí, né, uma semana muito proveitosa e um ótimo trabalho a vocês. Obrigado.
E neste momento, convidamos a professora mestre Regina Ferreira de Araújo, chefe do Departamento de Turismo da UFRN, para o uso da palavra.
Boa tarde. Eu fui pensar hoje o que é que eu ia falar aqui para vocês. E aí me veio 20 anos de memória, né? Desde aluna da graduação, professora substituta, aluna hoje do PPG-TUR e professora de muitos aqui. Então, sou colega dos alunos do PPG-TUR, sou colega dos professores do departamento e hoje chefe, né? Faz só 3 meses, mas está sendo um desafio muito bom, porque é maravilhoso a gente fazer o que gosta. Tenho observado aqui, né, na sala dos professores, que o PPG-TUR realmente, com essa nota 5 e rumo ao 6, né, esse evento internacional, não é por acaso. E é uma característica dos turismólogos, né, nós, turismólogos, de corrermos atrás dos desafios. Tudo que nos é proposto, precisa disso, a gente vai lá e tenta, pelo menos, né? E, na maioria das vezes, a gente consegue. E hoje eu estou aqui porque realmente eu tentei, né, e busquei, lutei e consegui. E quero deixar aqui um recado, né, para os alunos, principalmente da graduação, que estão começando o caminho agora, e do primeiro período, né, dos quais eu sou tutora, que vocês planejem o que vocês querem, visualizem, corram atrás. E sejam felizes, façam o que vocês gostam. E comecem sendo felizes hoje na abertura deste evento, com o professor Emanuel, que eu tive a honra de assistir aula semana passada, e é muito bom. E sejam felizes, não só nesse evento, como na vida. O trabalho e o estudo, às vezes, parece ser um fardo, né, na vida de muitas pessoas. Mas, quando a gente trabalha com o que gosta, estuda o que gosta, todo dia é um prazer para mim vir para cá, de manhã, de tarde e de noite. Eu não me canso. Ai, Regina, você é muito atarefada, né? Faz outra graduação, faz doutorado, dá aula, é chefe. Eu digo, e nem parece. Ainda faço jiu-jitsu. Bora terminar a aula no horário que eu vou para o jiu-jitsu. Terça e quinta, às 18h30, projeto de extensão gratuito no ginásio, tá, gente? É só chegar. Ali um aluno que já foi porque eu indiquei. Então, sejam bem-vindos ao evento, organizado com muito capricho, carinho e dedicação pelos professores e alunos. Obrigada a todos que estão trabalhando no evento. E aproveitem o máximo. Tem muita coisa boa essa semana.
E neste momento convidamos a professora doutora Medeiros Brandão, vice-diretora do Centro de Ciências Sociais Aplicadas da UFRN, para o uso da palavra.
Boa tarde. Que desafio falar depois de falas já tão completas. Confesso que eu tinha pontuado alguns elementos para trazer na fala para vocês hoje, mas todos eles, sem exceção, já foram devidamente falados. Então, resta-me pouco, né? E neste pouco que me resta, eu gostaria de, em nome da direção do CCSA, saudar a todos os presentes, fisicamente ou virtualmente no EITUR, que traz um tema tão relevante, né? Que esse encontro ele seja realmente um espaço para que a gente possa estar refletindo os desafios enfrentados pelo turismo e, mais do que isso, possamos estar prospectando alternativas inovadoras sobre diferentes olhares metodológicos, teóricos, práticos, para a busca da superação desses desafios, para que a gente possa realmente fazer do turismo uma estratégia de transformação da realidade social. Gostaria, além de falar em nome da direção, falar também em meu nome, enquanto egressa, né, do curso de graduação e do mestrado em turismo, e dizer que é sempre uma enorme satisfação estar nos eventos de turismo fazendo essa abertura, porque me traz um sentimento de muito orgulho pela trajetória percorrida, não apenas na minha trajetória pessoal, mas pela trajetória percorrida pelo curso de turismo, quando ainda era um curso sem um departamento próprio, sem um mestrado e sem um doutorado, e um espaço tão curto de tempo, como a professora Fernanda colocou, conseguiu crescer, se consolidar e se firmar como um dos mais importantes cursos, né? E com essa trajetória de evolução tão rápida do nosso centro. Então, a gente tem muito orgulho do curso de turismo e a gente reconhece que essa evolução é fruto de um esforço coletivo, né? É de um esforço desde os alunos que são inquietos, que são contestadores, que nos desafiam diariamente a ser e fazer melhor. É fruto de um esforço dos nossos professores que se dedicam diariamente no processo de construção e compartilhamento do conhecimento, seja através do ensino, da pesquisa e da extensão, nos níveis de graduação e pós-graduação. É fruto de um esforço de uma equipe do CCSA que busca trabalhar diariamente para dar o suporte, né, ao desenvolvimento das atividades do curso, da pró-reitoria, né, de pós-graduação, que tem dado um apoio inconteste, né, nesses últimos anos, tem desenvolvido um trabalho muito importante na busca cada vez mais de uma excelência acadêmica e da nossa universidade, da sociedade como um todo, né? É fruto de um esforço realmente coletivo. Então, em nome da comissão, né, organizadora desse evento, o professor Ricardo, o Guilherme e a Josimere, eu gostaria de parabenizar, não só pela organização deste evento, mas parabenizá-lo pelo desenvolvimento de todas as atividades que vocês desenvolvem diariamente, né? Parabenizar a todos os professores, a todos os alunos de graduação e de pós-graduação que fazem com que essa trajetória ela possa ter sido alcançada. Gostaria também de desejar boas-vindas a todos que não são do CCSA e da universidade, que estão participando desse evento, fisicamente ou virtualmente. Vi que temos várias instituições de ensino brasileiras participando das mesas, dos minicursos, das oficinas, a UF, a UFAL, né, Instituto Federal, várias instituições. Isso mostra que o turismo é assim, ele é agregador, né, ele é articulador. Nós queremos sempre crescer, mas queremos crescer juntos, né, reconhecendo a importância ali de todos, e não só da academia, como do poder público também, com a Câmara Municipal e também das escolas estaduais, também com representantes do trade, né? Porque entendemos que o desenvolvimento do turismo ele precisa ser realmente participativo e colaborativo. E desejar boas-vindas, né, ao nosso professor conferencista, o Emanuel, eu não sei pronunciar, Né, desejar boas-vindas, que vai trazer um tema também tão instigante, diferente, desafiador e inovador, né, as geografias da escravidão e o patrimônio, né, a herança colonial. Né, é sobre esses novos olhares, de olhar o turismo por uma lente ainda não vista, eu acho que é o que carece, muitas vezes, as nossas pesquisas. Então, assim como este tema, né, tão inovador, vários outros temas vão ser abordados nesse evento, por isso eu desejo que vocês realmente façam desses dias um espaço de rica aprendizagem e de troca de conhecimentos e experiências, e que, como resultado deste evento, várias parcerias possam serem desenvolvidas na construção de uma agenda de pesquisa que gerem frutos futuros. E contem para isso sempre com o apoio do CCSA e da UFRN. Muito obrigada, né, a todos e todas, e desejo um excelente evento.
Agradecemos a presença dos componentes da mesa e os convidamos a ocupar lugar no auditório para assistirem à continuidade da programação. Para darmos continuidade à cerimônia, convidamos com grande satisfação o professor Dr. Emanuel Adungyapong para proferir a conferência de abertura. E para mediar este momento também, convidamos o professor Dr. Mozart Fazito Rezende Filho, do PPGETUR, a compor a mesa. Informamos que, ao longo da conferência, a nossa equipe estará passando na plateia com papel e caneta para coletar as perguntas que devem ser encaminhadas por escrito ao nosso convidado. Então, com a palavra, o professor Mozart Fazito Rezende Filho.
Boa tarde, pessoal. Obrigado pela presença de vocês. Eu vou fazer a mediação, então, a princípio, eu vou apresentar o professor, falar um pouquinho do currículo dele e de como que essa parceria nossa se inicia, assim, mas eu vou fazer isso bem brevemente, né, para não tomar o tempo da própria palestra, né, da própria conferência. Então, o professor Emanuel Adungyapong, Akwasi Adungyapong, agora nós sabemos que Akwasi é um nome da alma dele, nós aprendemos aí, um pouco sobre a realidade de Gana, então ele é ganês, formado pela Kwame Nkrumah Universidade de Ciência e Tecnologia em Gana, mestre em Turismo, Meio Ambiente e Desenvolvimento pelo Departamento de Geografia do King's College, em Londres, mestre em Estudos e Desenvolvimento pelo Instituto Internacional de Estudos Sociais da Erasmus University, em Roterdã, na Holanda, mestre em Relações Internacionais pelo Instituto Barcelona de Estudos Internacionais, lá em Barcelona, e doutor em Planejamento e Estudos Urbanos pela Sheffield University, no Reino Unido. Foi professor de Gestão em Turismo na Sheffield Hallam University, na Lincoln University, e hoje é professor de Geografia Cultural em Wageningen, na Holanda. Seu principal projeto de pesquisa é intitulado Touring the Past, Transforming the Future, Slavery, Heritage and Tourism in Ghana, Suriname, Netherlands Triangle. Então, ele faz pesquisa sobre o patrimônio da escravidão nas colônias holandesas. A princípio, Suriname e Gana, né, e ainda o que tem lá na própria Holanda, e ele veio conhecer a nossa realidade, porque nós também fomos aqui, tivemos uma colonização holandesa por algumas dezenas de anos no século XVII. Mas, além disso, ele possui trabalhos nas áreas de metodologias qualitativas de pesquisa social, turismo sustentável e estudos de desenvolvimento. Nós somos colegas de Comunidade Internacional de Estudos Críticos em Turismo, e ele veio para passar 2 semanas aqui como uma primeira ação de colaboração. Nós estamos ministrando uma disciplina em módulo, em conjunto, sobre tópicos especiais em turismo crítico para os alunos de pós-graduação. Vamos também fazer algumas reuniões de colaboração de pesquisa, de pensar em projetos em parceria e tudo mais. Vamos ter várias participações aqui no EITUR. Então, além dessa conferência de abertura, o professor Emanuel também coordenará uma oficina de publicidade em pesquisa, assim, de como divulgar pesquisa a partir de vídeos, de uso de multimídias, que ele faz um trabalho muito interessante com isso, com as próprias pesquisas. E vamos também coordenar em conjunto um minicurso sobre a obra do professor Keith Hollinshead, como ele é uma grande autoridade, ou foi uma grande autoridade do turismo crítico, faleceu no ano passado, então nós vamos prestar a ele uma homenagem. Nada mais justo do que compartilhar com o pessoal aqui da UFRN os seus ensinamentos, as suas teorias desenvolvidas ao longo da vida acadêmica dele. Então, mais uma vez, eu agradeço profundamente a presença do professor Emanuel e vou passar para ele a palavra para iniciar a sua conferência. So, Emanuel, yeah, I said that I would hand in the word to you, so you can take the microphone. I think você pode já você prefere sentar aqui? Ou sorry, do you prefer to sit here? Yeah, of course you do. Ele quer falar do púlpito, né? Que aí ele muda assim.
it's much better like this. Okay. Good afternoon. Bom tarde. Yeah, obrigado a todos. And that's where my Portuguese ends. But actually, I was thinking I will write everything in Portuguese and then try to say it in Portuguese, but I realized that's even worse because you can't hear my pronunciation, so you can't even understand. So I thought I would stick with the English, and I've tried to already pre-translate some of the slides so that at least you can follow what I'm trying to say. And at the end, yeah, we will all understand each other. But first off, I want to say thank you very much, all of you, for coming and to hear me speak and to share your knowledge with me, because I'm hunting for new ideas and new knowledge. So it's more, I'm looking forward to you asking me questions so I can hear about what you think about what I'm going to say. And thank you very much, Mozart, for the invitation to come all the way and, yeah, hosting me here. I'll try to make it not too long so that we can have time for interactions. So I've already been introduced, so I'll just go straight into it. So my big project is called Geographies of Slavery and Colonial Heritage. So what I'm interested in is to look at how tourism deals with the past of slavery, the past of colonial heritage, and how that helps us to live in society, because this is a past that we have to deal with in society. And I have all this summary, which is on the website, but basically this is the summary of it. I think I'll try to go through this so that in case you fall asleep, then at least you know what the rest of the talk is about, in case I make you fall asleep. So basically, slavery and colonial heritage are difficult heritage because of what they signify, and importantly, because of the varied responses they evoke. Many people have different ways in which they relate to slavery and colonial heritage. If someone says slavery heritage, for some people it's like, oh, I don't want to talk about it. Or rather, we don't talk about it because it's so long ago. But for other people, it's important that we talk about it because it still shapes how we live in society. Not only in Brazil, not only in the Netherlands, but around the world, there is still traces of the slavery and colonial past that shape how the world is today. So it's important. And tourism can play an important role in that. And that's the argument I want to make, that we should think of tourism even as an applied science, as the center is, that it can also do more. Beyond bringing money from tourists, tourism can also help us to deal with this difficult and sensitive past. And this is the other part, so I'll read just the last part. So then, slavery and colonial heritage sites are not a given. They become through the transformative memory work of tourism practices and performances. And in this keynote, what I want to argue is that beyond economic returns, tourism offers an important lens on understanding our globalized societies and how we deal with the past. It is time to pay a particular attention to transformative world-making power of tourism in making, demaking, and remaking our sociocultural worlds by activating public memories of the past while building emotional solidarity or connection between the past, the present, and the future that we all share. So that's the argument I want to make. And let's start with some headlines. Sorry, this is only in English. So especially in the US, not too long ago, there were lots of issues when plantations began to tell different stories. So for a long time, many plantations in the American South where slavery did happen, when you go on a tour to these plantations, all you are told about is the big nice house and the big nice lawns, and some of them are just wedding venues. There is nothing about its past. And some tour guides began to change the narrative and say, actually, let's talk about what actually happened here as well. And there was a lot of pushback from tourists who said, no, I didn't come here to hear about this story. I came to see this nice building. I came to hear about who lived here in the nice mansion and how they lived their lives. So the people were pushing back against this narrative about the slavery that did occur in these places. And not only that, but also closer home to Brazil, in Lisbon, there was a talk of establishing a Museum of World Discoveries, and that opened up a whole box of issues about, did Portugal discover Brazil? I mean, there were people already living here. So words matter. So this whole discussion about a museum, which is for tourists and for tourism, opens up this debate within society about how do we even talk about the past. And so a walking tour in Lisbon currently tries to deal with the slavery and colonial past by showing people that it wasn't only in Brazil or Cape Verde or Sao Tome, but also in Lisbon itself, you could see the traces of this past. So even if you try to run away from it, it's still there and we need to pay attention to it. Okay, so I've already said what the talk is about, and these are, as a teacher in me, I stick to what the objectives are. So I have 4 objectives. First, I want to tell you about this concept that I'm developing and playing with, known as the embodied absence of the past. And then I'd like to show you what tourism does. So tourism perform not only development work in terms of economic revenue, but also it has cultural and political implications. So what sort of cultural work does tourism do? We know from cultural tourism that it helps to keep cultures alive, because otherwise some cultures and some cultural activities might go extinct. But beyond that, what is the political work of tourism? How does tourism deal politically with sensitive issues in society regarding who belongs and how we share development outcomes across different groups? And then finally, I'd like to show you different practices in different places. So also from here in Brazil, but also in Ghana, in Suriname, and the Netherlands, how tourism plays this role in different ways and how we can begin to think of tourism beyond what we usually see it for. And finally, we'll look at how tourism itself creates liminal spaces. So just as an example, before the program started, we were in the corridor, some were queuing. That was a moment in between. The program is yet to start, but you've already left where you were. You are sort of in between, and this is what we call liminal spaces. So the in-between place where you are not already there. You're not there. The program hasn't started, but it's sort of waiting. And for tourism, what happens within this liminal space when you go away? Because when you travel for tourism, you are not at your home. You are in a new place where you're not really belonging there. And sometimes we think, wow, I don't know anyone here. I can party and have fun. But within that liminal spaces, there is also the possibility that you learn new things. And that can lead to transforming how you see the past, but also how you see the place where you go. Okay. So part 1 then, what's the relation between tourism, memory, and heritage, especially with regard to slavery and colonial heritage? And we start in Rio. So sometime to the lead up of the World Cup and the Olympics, they were digging in Rio. Most of you, hopefully, have already heard about the Valongo Wharf. And they came up to this and thought, ooh, what's this? And then archaeologists were called in, and after much research, they discovered actually this is traces of the wharf. So a wharf, like a harbor, where when slave ships from Africa arrived in Brazil, this is where they docked. So about 1 million Africans disembarked at this very place. And for a long time, we were not aware, because it was there, but it wasn't there. It was covered by layers and layers of not only soil and concrete, but also layers and layers of other stories and other histories and time. So by digging this out, immediately there is something that we have to do with it. What do we do with these traces? And then a signboard appears, and people begin to talk about what this represent in terms of remembering the past and people who live in this country at this moment. Oh yeah, I have it here. So not only is the Valongo Wharf important in Brazil, but also in the whole of Latin America. It's the only trace that we have of the point of, say, disembarkation of enslaved people when they arrive from Africa. So it's significant not only for Brazilians, but also for other people of African descent within Latin America, because perhaps for some of them, they touched there first before they were transferred to other countries. Yeah, so that becomes important for us to think of, how do we deal with this? Should we just put a sign on it? Do we have tour guides there? What stories emerge just from discovering this? And what we know is that this place has now been transformed. So basically, we discovered it, it became a heritage. And then people not only deal with it in the past, but also in the present, because people are connecting it. So people of African descent living around Rio claim this site because it's a way for them to connect with their past. So there are sort of religious services, there are practices that are happening in this very place. Not only for themselves, but also for people who go to Rio. As a tourist, I want to see places of Rio, and I come to this place. But not only are you seeing this as something of the past, but if you encounter people engaging in these practices, you begin to make the connection that is still important for people living here. And that's what tourism can provide us. So there was a washing ceremony, but not only sort of religious activities, but even capoeira. And the history of capoeira and how it relates to people of African descent, how it relates to Brazilian heritage becomes more visible because we have this side and because we can then have this practice there, that people can make the connection between the past and the present. So heritage then allows us to remember. It activates that memory, the memory of the past, the memory of who came here, and the memory of how their history, their heritage still persists up to this point. And then the other thing to mention is that this place, though it's a place of difficult heritage because it's painful, it's about enslavement, now the memory can also be one of happiness, because for many people, it's important to know where you're coming from, to have a place to touch and say, okay, this is the point where I can touch and say, this is my root, or this is part of my root. So for many people of African descent, it's a matter of, okay, for a long time, you might hear, well, what's your history, where's your heritage? But having this provides a point of touch for them to be able to relive the memory and deal with it in the present. And then I take you to Lisbon. So in Lisbon, for a long time, I mean, there's been lots of debate about what's the role of slavery and colonial heritage in Portugal in terms of the wealth and growth of Portugal. But for a long time, there are lots of tours that were happening that shows you the glory of Lisbon, the glory of Portugal, and then you have the monument to discovery on the port of, or on the beachfront of Lisbon. But that was the story. That was one narrative being told through tourism about the glories, about how great the empire was, about how rich it got, but actually how it connected to other people's history and heritage, which for them is not as glorious or more difficult, was not told. So there came a tour guide who decided actually it's time to tell the other side of the story in this city, because it's this same traces, so this same tourism traces that you can use to tell the story about the glories of the Portuguese Empire. These same traces also tells us about the other side. So he began to organize this walking tour that basically makes visible the role of Portugal in transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. Also because there is a growing number of people of African descent in Portugal, some born there, some who moved there when they are young, and they want to see also their history and their heritage as part of the national history of Portugal. Because if you are a black Portuguese, you need a connection. How did I end up here? And this is part of the story. And so it needs to be told. And this tourism activity, therefore, then makes it possible to begin to have that conversation. Because what happened, especially with Naki, is once the tour begins, it gets exposure in media. So it moves beyond just being a tourism product to him giving a TED talk about what he's doing, about the impact of it, him being engaged in citywide activities and memorial, which is this one. So from the tour and from the work of other people who are saying, actually, where are the traces of African heritage in Lisbon? Because we know there is. We know there was an encounter, if you call it like that, between Portugal and other parts of Africa. So where are the traces in Portugal? How do we commemorate? There are many statues and monuments to people of the past, but what about people of African descent? So through, long story, public participation with the budgeting, they managed to get this monument agreed to be erected in Lisbon as a monument, and I have the notes here. So it's called Plantation prosperity, this is Portuguese, prosperity and nightmare. Basically, like I said, the same point of heritage, for some people, it's a story of prosperity, but for other people, it's a point of pain. And so we need to be able to have that conversation, difficult conversation, however it is, to deal with this shared heritage and this shared history. So the idea with this monument then, I need to get my notes. So the idea with this is to be a memorial, as a symbol, to be a work by someone of African descent. So the one who got the final, kind of go ahead to design this is of Angolan descent. So he's from Angola, there's Portugal, Angola, there is that connection, and this is supposed to be a memorial for slavery, but also for colonial heritage that relates to Portugal. And there is a lot of symbolism also, so part of it, so the artwork will be about 500 sugar canes. So these metal ones will be sugar cane, and there will be a place, sort of a central place, as you can see, people playing capoeira, and I showed you capoeira happening in Rio, that connection to make that visible in this heritage memorial site. Okay, so that's just an example, and now to complicate it, because that's what academics do, take the simple everyday examples and complicate it. And basically, what these examples show, it's about the dissonance that we have with heritage. So every heritage site represents someone's heritage and not others. So once you point out, okay, we label this as national heritage, in some way, you ignore other people's histories and heritage. You can't fully represent everyone's history and everyone's heritage within a given monument. That's what we have to deal with. Whatever we do, some might feel left out. And that is good, because then it allows us to have a conversation. Because if everyone feels fully represented, then we don't have that difficult conversation. Or then we can get replication of monuments. But sometimes we need to have the conversation about, okay, the statue in Lisbon, it represents one story. There is only one woman, for example, in the whole statue. Oh, I didn't show it yet. But there's the monument to discovery in Lisbon, shows the head. So artwork of all the great men of Portugal. There is only one, Queen Elizabeth, Isabel, on it. So for many women who were part of Portuguese history, they are not represented. But importantly, for people of African descent, they don't feel represented in that. And this memorial for slavery and colonial heritage, some group might also feel not represented. But that is what we have to deal with, because there is dissonance. Because once you try to call heritage, put it there, then it's a process in which you are taking from the past what you consider important. So you can't represent everything that has gone on in the past. You take out what you consider important. And in that process, some might feel slightly less represented than others. But that's what, in academic terms, we call dissonance. Okay, so dissonance then is often used in music theory when people are trying to sing. At least when you were singing the national anthem, there was not much dissonance. I could hear everyone was singing the parts well. But sometimes you might have people singing not in accordance with each other. And this idea in music theory has been brought within tourism to think about how when we narrate and interpret the past, sometimes we have this divergence. And that is especially important when it comes to difficult heritage, because this is heritage that still hurts. So the Valongo Wharf, it still hurt for certain community. There is a process of healing that is going on through that possibility to engage with that side. But it hurts, so there is that dissonance there. So that's sort of the big picture about heritage is important because it allows us to think about the past and remember the past. But heritage also creates dissonance. So there is always a tension between what we remember, how we remember, and how people engage with our remembrance process. Because it's not everyone's past, but how do we deal with the tension that happens in between? Which leads me to ask these sort of questions about the contestations we have about the past. So there are lots of contests about how do we remember the past, actually what is remembered, what is commemorated, what is memorialized. So sometimes some things are remembered, and you might think of yourself, things in Brazilian history that is remembered, but is not commemorated. So we remember it, but there is no monument that has been created for it. There are other things that there are lots of monuments that were created in the past, but we no longer deal with it. We no longer remember it. So what do we remember when it comes to slavery and colonial past? Within Brazil, within Portugal, within the Netherlands, how do we commemorate it? But also the question is, who does the remembering? Is it the minority group that does the remembering? Is it the majority group that does the remembering? Is there participation in how we get to remember the past and how we commemorate it, how we build a monument for it or not? But what I'm most interested in is how tourism helps in this process. So with Naki's walking tour in Lisbon, it was on the periphery. So the possibility of tourism is that it starts very small. Someone starts a walking tour trying to tell people about the traces all around them. Over time, it gains momentum, and it begins to shift the narrative from the periphery to the center. And that's part of the reason why this monument is going to be built, which has been delayed by COVID and also by internal politics in Lisbon at the moment. But basically, tourism allows some narratives to move from the periphery. So maybe it was just a narrative about some group somewhere far away, but as tourism begins to develop, the narrative about their history, their role, begins to gradually shift to the center, because tourists go there, they come back, they know the story, they tell other people, they hear about the story, they're able to spread that news about the narrative about actually why we need to remember this group and their heritage. And then there are questions about how do we balance the commodification of tourism. Tourism, by definition, is commodification, especially when it comes to heritage. To be able to go to a heritage site, yeah, you need to commodify it. You need to package it, make it a commodity that people can buy and exchange. And I was surprised, actually. We've been to fieldwork, and there was no entry charge, as far as I know, which is surprising to me, because in Ghana, if you want to go to Amina, Slave Castle, you pay, whether you're Ghanaian, you're outsider. So there is a bit of commodification in it. When money enters the equation, how do we deal with the ethics of it? Are people just trying to make money out of a difficult past, or how do we raise funds to manage it? So these are questions we need to then think of. Okay, so that's background, and now I will tell you a bit about my research. And for my research, then, let's bring the Portuguese. So my main theoretical starting point is the primacy of place. So my primary interest is place. Which place in a given country, in a given part of the world, becomes slavery or colonial heritage site? Yeah? What performances goes on in that place? But also, what are the practices? As I said, in Ghana, you go to a slavery or colonial heritage site, you have to first pay, you have to go and wait for a tour guide to come, he takes you around, he tells you the story, you have time to do what you want. The sites that we've been to, there was no entry fee, which is slightly different. So I'm interested in how practices differs in these places, but also what performances tour guides put up. Because tourism, and especially tour guides, is about performance. Tour guides perform. They perform telling you a story. And when we went to Recife, there was a performance from the tour guide in terms of the kind of expressions that they use, because they want the tour to be memorable to you. And to be memorable, there has to be some sort of performance. So you can remember not only the performance, but also what was said. So I'm interested in these three Ps. Place, which place becomes where we go. So why did we have to go to Fort the Magis? Magos, yes, that's it. How did that place become the place you go to if you want to encounter the past? Are there other places around here that hasn't had that exposure that also share the same history and heritage? And what sort of practices are there, and what sort of performances are there? So why I start there is because I believe between practice and performance, there is tension. So there is the tension of, I've been in Elmina in Ghana where someone of African descent from Jamaica, he came there and he was told he has to pay. And he said, no, I'm not paying. Why should I pay? It's my history, it's my heritage. So why should I pay? So between the practice and the performance, there is a space for conflict, but also for transformation. For some people, they go, bring the Portuguese. For some people, they go there in this space, they encounter a practice, they encounter a performance. It can transform how they see the past, how they see the present. But sometimes it's also, there is a danger of conflict, because for some people, they might think, well, I don't trust what you're telling me. I have a different story. And that can generate all sorts of conflict within the tourism encounter. So that's why I focus on these three areas, that when we pay particular attention to how tourism is done in particular places, we're able to identify the spaces of transformation, how tour guides are able to transform individual but also collective memories. Sometimes we take it for granted that tourism happens, and we need to understand how the practices and performances allow spaces for things to change. So this is just some explanation about why I'm interested in this performance and performativity 10, because in a way we all perform. Yeah, we are all in a performance. It comes from, you might say, performance studies. You perform being a student, they perform being a lecturer. There is a performance element to it. So a lecturer comes, you can see from how they are dressed with a tie. I'm not putting you on the spot. A student comes, there is a performance. A student is supposed to sit, to listen, to raise hands, to ask questions. If we want to change the dynamics within a classroom, we first need to understand this performance, because we're interacting against each other. So if you want to say, okay, how do we make sure that power dynamics are equalized? Because there is a power dynamic, whether we like it or not, between a teacher and a student. But if we want to make changes within, we need to understand how the performance works, because we're always performing. You're performing with your friends. It doesn't mean it's fake. It just means that how we deal with people over time, you do the same thing over and over again, and often you begin to do it without even thinking about it. You just perform in a role. And so by paying particular attention to how tourism performs its role, how tour guides perform their role, we're able to see actually, at this point, this is where actually you can tell the story that will have the most impact, because this is the point where tourists are most interested and are listening to you, not when it's left with just 15 minutes before the site is closing. At that point, some tourists are just there to take pictures, and you need to understand how tourist performance work to be able to do that. So that's why I'm interested in this performativity element. And the other point that I want to mention, which was in the title, is about liminal spaces. So tourism is a liminal space. You have your Portuguese, I need my English. It's a liminal space because it's sort of a void. So the process of being in the in-between. So when you are on a tourist trip, you are not at home, you don't really belong, it's just in between. You leave your daily performance of being a student or being a teacher or being a good boy or good girl home, and then you want to just be something else. You want to be just party, you just want to learn something about the place, but that's a liminal space. And in that liminal space, there is lots of things that can happen. One, because if we, like all of us, we might not know each other. If you put us in a bus, we go to a tour site. In that liminal space, we begin to form a sense of community, because we don't know anyone else. We begin to look at each other for cues as to, okay, should I believe what is being said? What should I do? We learn from each other in that interaction. So tourism provides a liminal space within which we can learn new things, but also we can challenge existing norms and existing ways of being, because you think, well, this is a different place, there's a different interaction. I don't need to behave like I behave at home because there's no home. So you are able to take on different roles and to challenge what is being said. So I have this as what tourism as liminal spaces creates. So it creates rituals or practices, process and performances. It flattens social structures. So if we go somewhere, there will still be some power differences, but because we are all tourists, it flattens the social structure. We begin to form this sense of community. And there is the possibility I already mentioned about challenging individual and collective social norms, heritage and memory. Because then one person can say, actually, what you're telling me, I can confirm because in my own community, this is what happens. And so within that liminal space, we can provide that support to challenge dominant narrative. But there is also that possibility of learning. And that's what we need to focus on as tourism researchers, as tourism students. How do we make sure that tourism is not only about hedonism, it's not only about partying and fun, but that within that space too, we can create room for people to learn new things. This is my concept of the embodied absence. I'll try to explain it. Basically, I use this concept of the embodied absence to mean the physical presence but narrative absence. So when we think of the Valago Wharf, it was always there. Yeah, it's always been there. It's just the narrative that was absent, partly because we haven't dug down to recognize it. So this idea of the embodied absence of the past is, especially within European societies, there is the physical presence. People of African descent are there. You go to Portugal, you go to the Netherlands, you go to Spain, there are people of African descent. Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Spanish, Afro-Portuguese, they are always there. But it's their narrative that has been absent. There are also traces of their past in the buildings, as you can see in Portugal and Lisbon, in Spain, in the Netherlands. There are all these traces. In the Netherlands, you see buildings that has tobacco leaves as part of it. It's like what we have now as house number. In the past, they didn't have house number. So if someone owned a plantation in Suriname or in Guyana or Berbice, that was a sign to show. You have houses in the middle of Amsterdam with the faces of black people. So you have the heads of more people there, also on family crest. That was a way for families to signify their wealth. So it shows that I have a plantation, I have enslaved people working on my plantation somewhere else. These traces they are there, but it's the narrative about them that has been absent. And tourism begins to tell this narrative and makes that possible. So that's what I refer to as the embodied absence of the past. And like I said, I'm interested in how, so how places, so you have lots of sites that are related to slavery and colonial heritage, but which ones become the place where you go to? Because we could have gone to many places in Recife, but we went to specific places because they are the place where everyone says in the talk, the tourists say, the guidebook says, this is the place where you want to go to. How does that happen? What's the process? And my argument is there are certain practices, as I've already mentioned, certain performances, certain narrative that begins to emerge that over time makes some place the place you go to. So Valago Wharf emerged, all of a sudden new practices emerge, new performances, new narrative, new stories emerge. They put a signboard there, they tell that story. So if someone comes to Rio and says, I want to tour places of Afro heritage, you go there because there's already been this practice and performances over time that has established it as the place. And then people go there, and people go there with their bodies, and bodies at different level. And bodies, like our individual bodies, are biography of history and heritage. So if I ask everyone to tell the story, show me your family tree, that in itself tells the history and the heritage of Brazil. If we all do our family histories, we can see that. So our bodies embody, in a way, we go with our history, with our heritage. So when we go to these places, the narrative that is told there, some connect directly to us. Some help us to fill in the gaps about our family tree and about our history. So we go there and have this embodied experience and think, why didn't I know this? I mean, I've lived here all my life, but I never realized that in Rio, we had the place where about 1 million black people disembarked from the slave ship. And then you begin to reconsider actually what you know about the past, also your own individual history and heritage, but also the collective societal history and heritage. So you have this embodied experience, and this is what I call the embodied absence of the past. So at that very moment, you have this awareness that there's been an absent, that some narrative has been absent that you didn't know, but that has always been there. It's always been there. But it's in that moment, that touristic liminal moment, that you realize, aha, now it begins to fall in place. I can get a better picture about our shared history and our heritage. And once that happens, then we need new things. Then we need new narratives about what we remember, about memory, but new narratives about actually who belongs. So if I give the example of the Netherlands, then we begin to think actually, who is Dutch? Because the wealth has also been through the work of people of African descent. And there's been lots of talk about go back home, you don't belong here. But once we get this awareness, we begin to think actually, we are part of what made society. So it's part of our heritage that constituted this heritage. I have written a paper recently about this concept, and I will encourage you to have a look. It's free to access in English, but you can use DeepL to translate, as I've done. Google Translate is good, but DeepL is even better. They are not paying me for this advert, by the way, just to say. So this is sort of how I define it. So I conceptualize it as fiscal awareness. So you gain that awareness of the fiscal presence by narrative absence. And that happens in that moment when tourism or tour guides begin to tell you, but not only tell you, but you begin to see, because the traces are there and they point it to you and they tell you the stories behind them, that you gain this awareness as well. I won't bore you with this because this is still work in progress, like how I operationalize it. So in research, you have your concept, but how do you collect data to kind of explain it? And this is how I'm thinking of it at the moment about what does it mean about embodiment. I already said our bodies holds the history, not only of ourselves and our family, but also of our communities. So we can look at that, but also what effect or affect you get. Do you get very emotional when you hear that story? How does your body feel? For some people, they go to Ghana and go to the slave dungeons, and some say, I get goosebumps on my skin when I hear the story and when I'm in that place. So I look at that as well. Okay, so this is my project. And basically, I'm looking at Ghana, Suriname, and the Netherlands, and now Brazil, Portugal, maybe, to see how this whole idea works. So first I thought, oh, this sounds like a good idea. I can see how it works in theory, in concept. And now I want to go to the field and see actually whether all that I'm thinking of is just making things up in my head, or actually I can see it. Of course, I started with kind of empirical observation. I saw things. I began to sort of try to understand, but then you need to do a bit more to make sure that you're not just basing it on a few observations, but that you can really have kind of empirical grounds to explain this concept of the embodied absence. So I focus on Ghana, Suriname, and the Netherlands because there is a shared history and heritage between these three places. And the question I ask is, how do tourism practices and performativity, I already mentioned tour guides, how they behave, tourists, how they behave, at the sites, what signages actually are there? How do they direct people to go around? How do these practices actually make visible this embodied absence of the past? And that's what my project it's about. So yeah, Suriname is very close to Brazil, so I'll add it to it. And now I'll just show you some few pictures, and then I'll end, and then we can have a discussion to see whether you agree, well, to see the extent to which you disagree, because I'm not looking for agreement, but I'm looking for, like I said, different ideas and ways to think about this shared history and heritage and its relation to tourism. It's 1 minute. My name is Dr. Emmanuel Akwesi Edwampong, an assistant professor in cultural geography at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. This is the story of my 3-year venue research project funded by the Dutch National Research Council, NVO. In this project, I explore how tourism transforms and narrates the past of slavery, specifically that between Ghana, Suriname, and the Netherlands, stemming from the transatlantic slave trade. My research combines insights from cultural geography, tourism studies, and heritage studies to develop this conceptual notion of the embodied absence of the past. In our diverse society, the more we tell the stories of the past, the more united we become, and the better we can tackle present challenges such as polarization, racism, and discrimination. So this is a teaser of a documentary that I made, about 7 minutes of it. Part of the project goal is at the end to make like a 40-minute documentary of these places, because apparently the new generation of students learn better visually than all the text. So I'm trying, but no TikToks yet. So you still need to stay for a bit longer and watch. But basically, as you saw with the woman crying, that's part of what I try to research. So how these places evoke emotions in people. And that evocation of emotion is also about memory. Memory about how the past has been, in many places, actively made absent. So absence is not just, it doesn't happen by chance, it's actively done. And we make absence by pretending things doesn't exist, by talking about one side and not the other side. And so I use absence not as something that, like, I forgot my car key. That can happen. But absence in this instance is an active process that we make, both individually but also societally. So I'll show you some pictures. I'll be your tour guide around. So this is Elmina, an area view of Elmina. As you can see, this is the Elmina Castle. Elmina Castle, Fort San Jaco. This was initially built by the Portuguese. They got kicked out by the Dutch. The Dutch extended it. So it was, the Portuguese came first, the Dutch stayed, the longest, but it's the English that had the most lasting impact. So that's why we speak English as our official language. So you come and then you go to a tour here. And as we will see, the practices of tourism are very similar, irrespective of the place that you go. Similar, but also different. And that's why by paying attention to how these practices work, we can understand how they have effect, different sort of effect on people's memory. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And then we come closer home. So again, there is we went to Fort Orange. We went to the 5 points fort in Recife with only 4 points. And then we went to this one in Natal. So basically, you have similar forts around the world. And by connecting these, we get a better picture of actually what has happened in the past. Because in many ways, we don't have the full picture about all these traces. So tourism, everyone travels, everyone goes to different places. If someone goes here and goes to Ghana and goes to Suriname and goes to the same forts, they get a better understanding of actually how the past is really connected. So it's not just one place, but it's in many places. This is the Portuguese. Oh, now it's working. Oh. This is the Portuguese church in Elmina, Elmina Castle. It's now a museum. So when you come to Elmina, you go here and wait for your tour guide before you start the tour. This is the Portuguese church as well. And this is the orange, yes, thank you. So again, it's quite similar, but then we try to understand actually what does that mean for understanding of the heritage. And this is the church here in Natal, in Marcos. This is the well. So this is the well in Elmina. Actually, the Portuguese had this well. When the Dutch came, they felt that the Portuguese might have poisoned it because it was fighting. So they decided, okay, we're not going to use this well. They went to build a different well at the part of the castle. There's been tests done, and it shows, there is no contamination. But the well still exists. and this is what we have also in Fort Orange. So again, in Ghana, there is no signage about this wall, but the tour guide tells you about it and the history about it. In Fort Orange, they have this there. So they tell you about the well, but they also tell you about how it was constructed, how it relates to Dutch heritage, and how they constructed their wells back there. This is in Elmina, so this is the condemned cell, this is the soldier cell. And you sort of find this in almost all castles that are related to slavery or colonialism. Because there was one cell for the locals who were stubborn and trying to rebel, and there was a different cell for soldiers. And you can see you barely have air, but for the soldiers, it's just punishment if they go out and get drunk. And you have a similar cell system also here where we went. And this is Suriname. What I didn't find was the signage of door of no return in the forts that we've been here. Also because these were, the forts in Brazil were forts where you come and yeah, it's just entry, there is no return. But in Ghana, the tourism practice has meant that there's been new signages, so doors that were just doors are now called doors of no return, because that was the last exit point for the enslaved when they went. But some doors have also now been turned as doors of return, because when people of African descent come, then there is a sort of a ritual process in which they do a tour and they go outside and they enter through that door to sort of signify that they did return. And that is important for many people in terms of their memory and their heritage. Oh yeah, this is worth showing. If it works again and is not annoyed with me. But basically in Suriname, they have this sort of tour product to tell the story. But they start with Elmina. So they have this banner there of the Elmina Castle. So they tell the story with the starting point of Elmina Castle and how people came and then went on the boat. And this is what I mentioned about ethics and commodification. So as part of the tourism product and practice, there is this, the slave market. And tourists are asked, do you want to get the chain on your hand? Again, people differ in their response. What's the meaning of this? How does that relate to the tourist experience? But tourism is about experience, and there is always that tricky edge between, is it just entertainment? Are we over-commodifying this because this is difficult and sort of sensitive heritage? Should we do this? Should we not? Does it add to the experience and memory or not? And for the mayor of Amsterdam, she thought it was a bad idea. She felt it was just, and one of her entourage felt it was just a Disneyfication. And actually one of the comment, I have it in Portuguese, was that actually this story belongs to a museum. And that is very debatable. In my view, having this experience, I mean, if we put the contentions with the chain aside, being there, being on a plantation, being there, feeling the heat, feeling the mosquitoes, who I was told they go to the gym because they are huge mosquitoes. So they really go to the gym and build up their muscles. But feeling they give you a sense of what people endured. And that makes a difference. If you just go to a museum, sanitized, air-conditioned, and you hear the story, it's much different than when you go to, say, a sugarcane plantation in Brazil and get a sense of it, of the heat, of the work that people had to do to build up the wealth that was distributed around. And that's about it. This is, TripAdvisor review. So part of the test of my concept was to see, do tourists see it the same? Do they also have this embodied absence of the past? How do they reflect on that? I will spare you, but just give you just a bit of snapshots of how people encounter it. So the last one is about, the tour was truly amazing. I was born and raised in the Netherlands and attended Dutch schools. I visit Amsterdam often. I had no idea that the city has so many hidden historical secrets. This part of the Dutch history was not given when I was in school. So for many people, they go on this tour the absence that has been actively created through a lack of information from the books. And you might consider for yourself in your own history books how much of the slavery and colonial past was taught to you, not only about what happened in the past, but also how it relates to the present. And then this is also about history being made visible. But importantly, I already mentioned the key role of the tour guide. What's the role of the tour guide in this transformation? Let's skip that and focus on the tour guide. So the tour guide is Jennifer, and this is what people have to say. There are lots of comments about the tour guide. I think it's important to focus on tour guides, because within tourism research, we don't do enough with the role of tour guides, the important role they play, not only in shaping experience, but also in the transformation and the record that they allow people to have when they go on this tour. Okay, it's the last one. So I read one in English. So Jennifer is blessed with a historian's intellect, an artist's eye, a great storytelling skill, and a poet's heart. She is a natural educator and an expert listener. Jennifer will show you Amsterdam as you have never seen it before, and you will invaluably tell your friends and family. So tour guides need to play all these roles. They need to be a poet, they need to be a historian, they need to be like everything. Also an entertainer, because there is a performative aspect of it that you keep people's attention. So we need to think about how we train tour guides, especially when it's related to this sort of heritage. Okay, so I'll finish now and conclude by reiterating the main argument I started off with, is that the embodied absence of the past refers to this physical presence but narrative absence. And absence, again, we shouldn't think of absence as in there is nothing being said about it at all. Absence is relative. Presence is relative. So it's not that there is no history or heritage being told of people of African descent in Brazil, in the Netherlands. There is something being said, but it's the weight of it. So how much of it is being said relative to the amount of history and heritage or years in which they've been part of these societies. That's what I refer to as this absence. So there is that absence, even though there is the physical presence. But importantly, the tourism provides an important lens because in many places, tourism starts this shift of narrative, and then we can have that discussion about the past. But there is always that question about, are we over-commodifying it, and what ethics should we think of when we think about this sort of heritage? Because it is a difficult heritage for many people, and many people feel like the inequalities that came with slavery and colonialism still persist to today. So we need to bear in mind how certain communities are still being disadvantaged in many ways. Obrigada pela atenção. Attenzione.
E neste momento, nós conduziremos uma mesa com questionamentos. Então, se você ainda não fez, né, e desejar, o pessoal da nossa equipe está aqui passando para recolher, tá bom? Então, nesse momento, passo a palavra para o professor, né, Dr. Mozart, para conduzir esse momento.
Bom, eu, em primeiro lugar, queria expressar uma enorme gratidão pela essa apresentação. Foi muito, muito interessante. Eu já conheci o trabalho do professor Emanuel e é impressionante como a cada dia que passa ele vai incorporando novos valores. Então, a gente conseguiu ver resultados de um trabalho de campo que nós fizemos há poucos dias. Enquanto as perguntas não chegam, vou falar um pouquinho sobre esses pontos principais do ponto de vista de quem pesquisa turismo. Primeiro, de entender o turismo para além dessa habilidade de geração de emprego e renda, mas o turismo, para o professor Emanuel, é uma porta pela qual você faz análise social de tudo, de todos os processos de desenvolvimento. Então, não é apenas um fenômeno que a gente observa de geração de emprego e renda. Não é? Isso é muito, muito interessante dentro da pesquisa dele. E aí ele procura esse espaço difícil, um patrimônio difícil, complicado, de dor, né, que é o patrimônio da escravidão. Bom, então as perguntas vão chegando, eu vou traduzir para o Emanuel para ele poder fazer os comentários dele. Yeah. Okay. At which extent the slave descendants feel comfortable in having their painful memory as a tourist attraction? Desculpa, gente. Até que ponto os descendentes de escravos se sentem confortáveis em ter sua memória dolorosa como atrativo turístico? É uma pergunta complexa, difícil, e vamos ouvir.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. That is a difficult question. There are two ways. So on one hand, it's the level in which you look at it. So are people of African descent happy to tell this difficult heritage? Depends on who you ask, and depends on what sort of tourism you are thinking about. So if when the Valango wealth was discovered, if there was no room for descendants to have a say about how it's to be done, then we ran into trouble. But for the Valango wealth, for example, it's the Afro community living around this place that took the lead to decide how we want to use this and how we want to remember it. And we need a state to come in to support that. So there is that level of engaging with the descendant group as to, okay, how do we tell the story? If it's stories that they have themselves, then it will be up to them to decide, okay, we want to tell this story. But when it's traces, so traces like a wall or a castle or a fort, then it's open to invite them to engage in that conversation, because at the end of the day, the state also has a sort of a say in this. So it's always about dialogue. It's about inviting them, having a dialogue with them, especially when it relates to traces within their community. And there is a tricky part. And I use the example from the Netherlands, where people of African descent living in the Netherlands are very, militant is not the word, but are very forceful in saying we need to deal with this past, we need to tell the story. While in Suriname, it's sort of different, because the concerns are different. People of African descent in Suriname, for a majority of them, they are concerned about their everyday, daily activities, and not necessarily this heritage, because they live there, they have that. It's the majority heritage. But say in Portugal or in the Netherlands, this heritage is minority, and so there is a bit more kind of push to tell the story. But it's always about dialogue and thinking, okay, to what extent do we tell it? And also, how do we tell it? So many communities say, yeah, we can tell it, but not increasingly, not from the perspective of without agency. So people are reclaiming this to show their agency. So it's not that they were just enslaved and they just worked, but also that they survive. So it's that part of the story. So it's how you tell it. You tell it from a hero point of view about those who resisted slavery in many ways, who were killed, or do you just tell about the enslavement only? So it's about the perspective that you tell the story that makes it easy or difficult to engage with these communities.
Bom, obrigado. Não é para eu fazer a tradução, né? Não, mas assim, eu acho que a gente pode fazer um pequeno comentário, né? Ele dá o exemplo para responder a pergunta do cais do Valongo, e que é claro que é uma herança muito complicada, mas a partir do momento em que há comunidades que sofrem com isso, há comunidades que sentem isso mais de uma distância menor, é claro que convidar essas pessoas a participar das decisões de como aquele espaço será gerido a partir daí, do ponto de vista turístico, você diminui, ou melhor, você, de certa forma, media um pouco esse conflito. Não é? Bom, ele fala mais um pouco sobre as diferenças das comunidades descendentes de africanos escravizados na Holanda e no Suriname. Que na Holanda eles têm muita preocupação com o passado, eles querem saber, eles querem contar a história, mas que no Suriname não, eles estão mais preocupados com a vida diária, né, o trabalho. Eles estão imersos naquele patrimônio, mas é um patrimônio que está mais vivo, né, que já está, enfim. É muito interessante a abordagem, e essa pergunta parece que dá uma continuidade, mas trazendo para um aspecto mais da pesquisa mesmo. A pergunta é a seguinte: eu gostaria de saber se, enquanto autor do turismo crítico, sua interpretação do turismo e de suas capacidades para além do mercadológico já sofrem críticas, ou foi considerada romântica ou esperançosa demais. Okay, the question is, as a critical tourism author, if the way you interpret tourism has been criticized as romantic or too hopeful, as naive, in comparison with the more market-driven research.
So the question is whether it's too hopeful. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I guess it's hope that keeps you alive, and there's also hope that kills you, because sometimes the hope doesn't happen. Yeah, there's been criticisms against market-driven understanding of tourism. I think the main thing is we need to recognize that, tourism is as it is. So it has to do a lot with the market, it has to do a lot with the economy, for many good reasons. So we need to recognize that. So it's not a question of doing away with that, but it's in saying, okay, it is as it is, an economic activity, but because it's also a liminal space creation activity, what more can we do? Should we just focus on the economic activities only, or is there room to look at this cultural and political work that tourism can do? Because people travel all the time, and we say that travel opens your eyes, you get to see the world, but with which lens? Do you get to see things that confirm your own beliefs, or is it an opportunity for you to challenge your own set of beliefs and your own ideas about your heritage, your history, your identity, about your past? So the criticism is there that perhaps this is too iffy in the clouds, but I think it's important to do that. So to keep drumming home the point that tourism can allow us to grow in terms of awareness, and that's important. So it's not only about the economic side, but we can focus on that. And even though it might just be small difference that we make, that's still important, because then you can think of not only the economic multiplier effect, but also the narrative multiplier effect that tourism can bring if we not give up hope that it can make a change.
Bom, então a resposta foi não como o turismo crítico, ele não tem o potencial econômico do turismo como uma oposição, né? Mas por que olhar apenas de um lado? Né? Por que olhar apenas desse lado da produção, da geração de emprego e renda, sendo que há um outro lado muito rico que tem a ver com um potencial de crescimento, de construção de representações, de imagem que as pessoas passam a ter de determinados espaços. Então, ele fala assim, não é só o efeito multiplicador econômico que é importante, mas o efeito multiplicador das narrativas também. Então, da mesma forma, o turismo, ele na apresentação, ele fala sobre a construção de você conhecer o passado, um passado escolhido, né, porque a gente não tem como saber todo o passado. Então, quem escolhe, de quem é o direito de escolher que passado permanece na memória de quem não é. Então, isso para ele é muito importante. Então, não é uma questão de fazer oposição, não é que o turismo mercadológico, né, como foi chamado aqui, é um turismo contrário ao turismo crítico. Não, o turismo crítico incorpora também o mercadológico, né? Então, vamos para a próxima pergunta. Eu acho bom a gente parar por aqui, que já tem um monte, e eu estou numa enrascada aqui com essa tradução, mas vamos lá. O Márcio faz a seguinte pergunta: compreendo o desenho do estudo através das práticas e da performance. Entretanto, percebo certo sentido no que se refere à dissonância de identidade e pertencimento. Em seu estudo, em algum ponto essas categorias são desenvolvidas? Em qual perspectiva? Ok. So he says he understood that your study goes through practices and performance. However, he realizes that to an extent, with regards to the dissonance, the identity, and a sense of belonging. So he asks, in which do you incorporate such categories, so identity and belonging, in your research? In which perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that I see it as an outcome. So when the triangle came, now it's too late. When the triangle came, then it's the last part. So practices come, people have the embodied experience, there is the embodied absence, and then there is these new narratives about identity and belonging. So it's there in the conceptualization, but yeah, I'm a one-man band, and the project is sort of limited. So I don't really theorize it so much. I don't really deal with, okay, what sort of identity, what sort of belonging. The main idea, the main focus now within this project is this right side of the triangle. So how tourism does the transformation of site to places, how it makes visible this embodied absence. And I know that becomes more secondary sort of data about the identity and belonging. And that comes from, the responses of tourists. So I'm not really dealing in much detail about the sense of identity. I'm just taking it as a given, rather than really theorizing it at this moment anyway.
Nesse projeto, ele não teoriza muito sobre esse assunto, né? A intenção é mais diretamente relacionada à prática. Então, é importante dizer, né, que o turismo crítico tem uma conexão muito grande com a prática, apesar dessa ideia de que fica vivendo no mundo das nuvens, né, e tal. Não é verdade. Mas ele pretende, porque, por enquanto, ele pega a identidade e as outras categorias como tidas como certo, como elas existem, elas estão lá. Mas ele não teoriza sobre elas, então ele diz que, quem sabe, num projeto futuro, ele o faria. Tem algumas perguntas, eu vou ter que fazer uma seleção aqui de duas. Então, eu vou misturar algumas perguntas. Beleza, tem uma de Valdislene, do doutorado, que está escrita em inglês, então eu vou traduzir para vocês e leio para ele, né? Como nós, profissionais da indústria do turismo, devemos performar, né, como forma de reduzir a dissonância entre a mercantilização e o senso incorporado, deve ser a teoria dele, né, a ausência incorporada do passado. How do we, professionals from the tourism industry, should perform in order to reduce the dissonance between mercantilization, or I think you say commodification, and the embodied absence of the past?
I think, or at least in the case of my fieldwork experience in Brazil so far, I think there is, at least in these slavery colonial heritage sites, there is little commodification of it. Like I said, there is no entry fee, which I find surprising. So that removes that, but also for tourism professionals, it's being aware that sometimes performances can go over the top. So you almost can't prescribe in advance. It's more making people aware of how some things and how they express themselves can mercantilize or commodify the past. So it's about, are there souvenirs being sold? What kind of souvenirs are being sold within the tourism place? How do tour guides encourage tourists? What do they encourage them to do after visiting a site? Stuff like that. But there is it's more case by case, to put it like that. But it's being aware that it's always tricky between commodification and also, say, authenticity. But being aware that different tourists, and that's the thing, different tourists come for different purposes. So for some tourists, like I said, in Elmina, the tour guides know, oh, there comes a bus. We know what they are here for. They are here to take pictures. So you first need to understand the categories of tourists who are coming to your place. And because you need to deal with your hope in reasonable way. If you know that certain groups of tourists are here for certain purpose, your role as a tour guide is to provide that. But there are other tourists who are coming for the learning experience. So you need to make sure that you're expending your energy on those that you can, and deal with it that way. So understanding your tourist segment, to put it like that, your marketing segments, and then dealing with them in accordance to that can help.
Bom, eu acho que, assim, baseado nessa pequena experiência que ele teve aqui no Brasil, ele percebe que uma relação que ele vê em comum com outros lugares é a necessidade de você entender para que turista você está trabalhando, né? Você entender quem é o turista. Você consegue, a partir do objetivo do turista, se adequar àquilo, a uma forma mais interessante de trabalho. Então, o profissional de turismo tem que estar munido com uma série de possibilidades de trabalho para poder ser flexível o bastante para ele conseguir, ao mesmo tempo, agradar o turista e transmitir a mensagem, né? Então, eu acho que isso tem uma relação com a ideia de que você tem que entender o processo inteiro para depois você analisar o processo e construir o processo novamente de uma maneira melhorada. Então, se você quer melhorar aquele processo, é necessário que você compreenda isso tudo. Isso eu estou falando mais a partir da palestra dele do que da resposta. Mas eu acho que é mais ou menos isso aí que ele quis, essa mensagem que ele quis transmitir. Então, nós temos duas perguntas aqui agora, que eu vou misturar, que são sobre como que a gente mede a memória da experiência turística e quais são os principais passos para o turismo atingir o equilíbrio entre a mercantilização e essa ausência incorporada do passado. Tá? Então, eu vou ler isso para ele e a gente aguarda a resposta. So, there are two questions that deals more or less with the same idea. One is asking, how can we measure the memory of tourist experience in slavery sites? And the other one, what are the main steps for tourism to achieve the balance between mercantilization and embodied absence of the past?
Yeah, that's the how do you measure? How do you measure experiences? I think that is, we shouldn't try to measure, to put it like that. I think that's an impossible task. I mean, you can have estimation, maybe because I am biased towards qualitative research, and think it's hard to measure memory. But for research purposes, I mean, one way to do that is through what the tourists say. So that's why I was showing you the TripAdvisor reviews. So it's measuring, okay, how do people relate to this? They've been on the tour. How has their memories changed? How have they been transformed in their thinking? Also because it's not only in that particular moment. For some, it's just like a seed that is planted. And that seed might take long to bloom because it gets exposed to different rainfall in different conversation, and then over time, it sort of emerges clearer. So it's difficult to measure. What we can do is approximate. And that's why I rely on the comments from TripAdvisor, but also speaking to tourists. So my research is I go to these places, I look at the practices and performances, I follow tours, so I go along to as many tours as I can. I speak to tourists when they come there. I follow them, so observe them as they're on the tour, speak to them afterwards. So in a way, it's not a quantitative measurement, it's more a qualitative teasing out actually what has changed between before you came and after you've gone on this tour. But I know that I'm also aware that it's not the most accurate because, again, it's not instant. They might gain that awareness, but whether it sticks, that takes time. And I think that is beyond the focus of what I can do or what we can do sometimes. So being aware of the limitation that you can't really measure. At the individual level, the most is more to look at what changes in society. So it's more at the societal level that we might be able to see these changes in memory and how we remember and how we commemorate. So that's more how I try to look at it, by looking at the social level sort of measurement to say, in the past 10 years, what has changed in terms of memorializing and commemorating these past, and how does the people, especially the tour guides, are they part of these events and initiatives that are changing the memory practices?
Bom, então ele responde primeiro sobre a mensuração. Para ele, não se deve medir memória, né? Não faz sentido. A pesquisa, ele fala que talvez ele esteja um pouco tendencioso, porque ele é da pesquisa qualitativa, mas o fato é que a observação, a forma de coleta de dados e análise de dados não tem a ver com tabulação, mensuração, com correlação. Na verdade, ele acompanha, ele faz um trabalho que toca em etnografias, né, em formas de coleta de dados que evitam as estruturas, né? Então, formas mais fenomenológicas, mais etnográficas, mais livres. E aí a observação que interessa, na verdade, é ao longo do tempo, na sociedade, o que mudou. Então, como que era a sociedade antes, como que era a memória antes e como que ela passa a ser depois de um tempo. Não faz sentido construir mensurações, formas de mensurações, categorias mensuráveis para isso.
So it's about the balance between commodification and embodied absence. So again, it starts with an acceptance that, yeah, by default, tourism is commodification, so we don't run away from it. We stay within the tension. And I always tell my student, tension is good. So conflict, well, conflict is not the word, but tension is good, because it's within the tension that you can effect change. So if we always run away from tension, then you don't grow, in a sense. So the tension between commodification and education is good. We need to be aware that there is a tension, and always keeping that in focus helps you in the moment to know how best to shift from one side to the other. And another example, for example, with commodification and embodied absence is not mixing group. So sometimes you might mix, those who are there for fun and those who are serious, and that can affect, the whole experience. So again, in Ghana and in Suriname, sometimes tour guides separate. They know this group of people, they are here, they want a more engaged experience. This group, they just want to hear a quick story and go and do their own thing. So by separating them and not mixing them, you ensure that each side of commodification, everyone gets their part, and each side of learning, everyone gets their part. And the other point I wanted to make, is that tourism, we can think of it as one of the only places outside of formal education where people get to learn about other places, other times, other people. So that puts, kind of importance for us as tourism scholars. So if you think of society, apart from formal education, where people come to a classroom and learn, tourism in that liminal space is one of the only other places where people pay attention long enough for a tour guide to tell them a story and tell them about the past, about other people, but also that a tour guide has much influence. Because when you go to a tour and a tour guide is talking, you listen. So that gives tourism quite an important role in how we engage with issues that tourism deals with.
Bom, então essa segunda sobre o passo a passo para equilibrar a mercantilização e a ausência incorporada do passado, ele não fala em passo a passo, ele fala que o turismo tem um potencial de educação, e um potencial pedagógico, e que esse potencial é muito importante, e que a própria tensão que é causada entre esse potencial e a ideia da mercantilização é boa. Essas tensões são muito positivas, porque elas produzem conhecimento. Então, não é você eliminar uma para tentar compreender a outra, é tudo acontecendo ao mesmo tempo. Então, para ele, o que interessa é que, se você evita a tensão, você previne de participar, de ter essa tensão naquele momento, você perde a oportunidade de desenvolvimento, de crescimento, de conhecimento, de produção de conhecimento. Daí, ele termina dizendo que, dentro da... Ah, sim. Obrigado. Ele dá um exemplo de dois grupos diferentes de turistas e como que eles reagiriam àqueles espaços, como que eles reagiriam às tensões nesse espaço liminal. Então, na verdade, eu acho que isso tem muita relação com o tipo de pesquisa que ele realiza, em que cada caso é um caso. Não há categorias de comparação. Então, ele fala, bom, para um grupo vai ser assim, para outro vai ser assim. E aí o resultado, mais uma vez, ele vai se materializar na sociedade como um todo. É o processo que, na academia, a gente chama de construção social. Né? A gente vai construindo a nossa cultura a partir desses embates, dessas tensões. E o que resulta é o que vira. Não tem como a gente prever o que vai virar ou guiar esse processo. Simplesmente existe dentro desse tipo de pesquisa a ideia de que você nunca usa um deveria ser. As coisas não deveriam ser, as coisas simplesmente são, né? Eu peço perdão, ficou uma pergunta aqui sem resposta, e eu imagino que seja de algum dos alunos ou das alunas do nosso curso, porque foi muito direcionada, então eu acho que a gente vai ter oportunidade. Mas eu vou apenas ler a pergunta só para... Mas assim, não vamos ter tempo para responder. Como se apresentam as posicionalidades dos sujeitos quando se considera o componente político desse tipo de intervenção turística? E sobre posicionalidades, aí já é uma conversa mais complicada, então ele vai demorar muito se eu perguntar, e a gente tem que fechar agora por causa da transmissão. Mas depois eu leio para ele. E quem perguntou pode vir conversar, que eu peço para ele responder, tá bom? Obrigado, gente.
Agradecemos, né, ao doutor Emanuel Edu Apong e também ao professor doutor Mozart Fazito Rezende, né, pela brilhante mesa. E nesse momento nós convidamos, né, para que eles possam retornar ao lugar deles no auditório. Muito obrigado. Amanhã continuaremos com a apresentação de trabalhos na modalidade virtual a partir das 9 horas e presencial às 14 horas, além de um minicurso presencial sobre etnometodologia às 16 horas e uma mesa redonda virtual. Lembramos que o EITUR 2023 é gratuito e as inscrições de atividades presenciais serão confirmadas diariamente na secretaria do evento. Por isso, cheguem cedo e garantam a vaga de